The empty warehouse. I've worked the night shift at the shipping warehouse for over a year. It's a boring job mostly. The kind of job where you can get lost in your thoughts while you move boxes from one place to another. The machines hum constantly, and the occasional clatter of crates being moved is the only thing that breaks the silence. I've always thought I knew every inch of the place. After all, it's my job to know. But that night, everything changed. It started like any other night. The air felt heavy, but I blamed it on the lack of sleep. I walked my usual rounds, checking the loading docks and making sure everything was in order. But as I moved between the stacks of crates, I noticed something strange. There was a door I had never seen before, slightly ajar, hidden behind a stack of boxes. It looked old, almost forgotten, like it didn't belong there. At first, I thought it was just a new storage room that I hadn't been told about. But then I remembered that I'm the one who usually gets the memos. No one mentioned a new room. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Something inside me said I shouldn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The room was small, dark, and filled with a musty smell that made me want to gag. There were shelves lined with old boxes and stacks of papers. At first glance, it looked like a forgotten storage area, but as I stepped inside, I realized this was something else entirely. The papers weren't just old shipping documents, they were passports, IDs, and photographs. Some of the photos were of people, men, women, and even children. All of them looked scared, their eyes wide with fear. I started to feel dizzy, my heart pounding in my chest. What was this place? Why were these things here? I didn't want to believe what my mind was telling me. I dug through the boxes, hoping I was wrong. But the more I found, the clearer it became. There were clothes, small toys, and even some jewelry mixed in with the papers. All of it belonged to people. People who weren't here anymore. And then it hit me. Human trafficking. This room was filled with the belongings of people who had been taken, shipped off to God knows where. I wanted to scream, to run, to get out of that place as fast as I could. But my legs felt like lead. My mind raced. Should I call the police? Should I tell someone? But what if they find out I was the one who found it? Would they come after me? I was frozen with fear, unsure of what to do. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps coming from somewhere in the warehouse. My heart stopped. Someone else was here. I quickly turned off the light and crouched behind a stack of boxes, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The door creaked open, and I could hear the person breathing. They were inside the room now, just a few feet away from me. I peeked through a gap in the crates and saw a man. His face was partly hidden in the shadows, but I could see enough to know he wasn't someone I wanted to meet. He was tall, with a rough-looking face and eyes that scanned the room like he was looking for something, or someone. I reached out and grabbed a metal rod that was lying nearby, holding it tightly, ready to defend myself if I had to. The man walked around the room, his footsteps echoing in the small space. He stopped right in front of the crates where I was hiding. I could see his boots, just inches from my face. My grip tightened on the rod, sweat dripping down my forehead. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure he could hear it. He stood there for what felt like forever, then slowly turned and walked away. I waited, not daring to move, until I heard the door creak shut again. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, my body trembling with fear. I wanted to run, to get out of there and never look back. But just as I started to move, I heard the man talking. He was on the phone, his voice low and cold. He mentioned something about the next shipment arriving soon. My stomach turned as I realized what he meant. More people, more victims, were going to be brought here. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I moved slowly, silently, towards the door, praying the man wouldn't notice. When I reached the door, I peeked out and saw him standing with his back to me, still on the phone. This was my chance. I slipped out, moving quickly but quietly through the warehouse, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a splash of cold water. I wanted to call the police, to tell them everything, but I couldn't. What if they came after me? What if they found out I was the one who uncovered their secret? I stood there, shaking, my phone in my hand, unable to dial. In the end, I walked away. I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to take the risk. I never went back to that warehouse. I quit the next day, told them I found another job. But the truth is, I couldn't go back even if I wanted to. Every night, I still see those faces, hear those footsteps. I live with the guilt, knowing that I did nothing. That those people might still be out there, suffering, because I was too scared to act, and that's something I'll never escape. I work as a cleaner at a shopping mall. It's not the best job, but it pays the bills. The mall is quiet at night, almost peaceful if you ignore the occasional creaks and groans of the old building. Most nights, it's just me and my crew going through the usual routine. But tonight felt different, like something was off from the start. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Maybe it was the way the lights flickered a bit more than usual, or how the air felt heavier, almost like it was hard to breathe. We've all gotten used to the empty corridors and darkened storefronts, but tonight, everything seemed darker, quieter. We moved through the mall, cleaning as usual, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Then we noticed it. One of the stores still had its lights on. That was strange because by now, every store should be locked up and dark. We stood there for a moment, just looking at the bright lights spilling out into the hallway. The door was closed, but through the glass I could see some movement inside, though it was hard to tell what was going on. Our crew leader, Tom, shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe someone just forgot to turn off the lights. He suggested we check it out, just to make sure everything was okay. As we got closer, my heart started beating faster. The store looked like a mess. Clothes were scattered on the floor and some shelves were overturned. That's when we heard it. A noise coming from the back of the store. It was faint, but it was there. Like something or someone moving. We knocked on the door, but no one answered. Tom decided we should go in, thinking maybe a worker got locked in or something. It didn't feel right, but we all agreed. We forced the door open, and as soon as we stepped inside, we knew something was very wrong. The place looked like it had been ransacked, and the air inside felt thick and heavy. We walked further in, and then we saw them. A group of masked men huddled in the back, clearly in the middle of robbing the place. They turned around and saw us at the same time we saw them. Everything happened so fast after that. Panic hit us like a wave. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears and my hands started shaking. The robbers were clearly just as shocked as we were, but they acted quickly. Before we knew it, they had us on the ground, tied up with whatever they could find. The floor was cold against my face, and I could feel the rough fabric of the ropes cutting into my wrists. I tried to stay calm, but my mind kept going to dark places. What if they decided to get rid of us? What if we didn't make it out alive? One of the robbers, the one who seemed the most nervous, kept pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it sounded like he was losing it. The others were quieter, but I could tell they were just as scared. We were all trapped in this terrible situation, and it felt like any wrong move could set them off. I don't know how long we were lying there. It felt like hours, but it could have been just minutes. At one point, one of my crew members, Maria, tried to get up, maybe thinking she could make a run for it. It was a mistake. The nervous robber jumped on her, yelling and threatening her with a gun. My heart nearly stopped. He was shaking so badly I was sure the gun was going to go off at any second. Maria froze and he finally backed off, but the tension in the room got worse after that. The robbers started arguing among themselves, voices low but urgent. I could tell they didn't have a plan, or if they did, it was falling apart fast. They started talking about what to do with us, and that's when the fear really set in. They couldn't just let us go, right? We'd seen their faces, well, their masks, but still, we could identify them. At some point, I thought I heard sirens in the distance. For a moment, hope flared up inside me. Maybe someone had called the police. Maybe we'd be rescued. But then the sound faded, and we were left in silence again. That silence was the worst part. It pressed down on us, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. As the night dragged on, I could see the robbers getting more and more desperate. Their voices got louder, and their movements more erratic. The nervous one, the one who had threatened Maria, kept glancing at the door like he was waiting for something, or someone. I tried not to think about what could happen next. I just wanted to survive. Then, everything went wrong. A loud noise came from somewhere in the mall, maybe just the building settling, but it was enough. The nervous robber snapped. He started shouting, waving his gun around. The other robbers tried to calm him down, but it was too late. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. I'm not sure what happened after that. Maybe the robbers finally made a run for it. Maybe the police did show up. All I know is that when I opened my eyes again, the store was empty, and the ropes around my wrists had been cut. The others were there too, alive but shaken. We never talked about what happened that night, not really. We just wanted to forget, to move on. But I can't forget. I still see those masks in my nightmares, still hear the sound of that gun shaking in the robber's hands. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if we really made it out, or if a part of us is still lying on that cold floor, waiting for the worst to happen. I've always worked the night shift. There's something peaceful about it, or at least there used to be. The office is small, just me and one other guy. We're alone in a building that feels more like a ghost town after hours. The lights flicker sometimes, and the hum of the air conditioning is the only noise that fills the silence. It's a strange place to work at night, but it pays the bills. The other guy, let's call him Mark, is weird. I don't know much about him. He keeps to himself mostly, doesn't talk much. And when he does, it's short, clipped sentences. He's not rude, just off. He's always there before I am, and he leaves after me. At first, I thought he was just dedicated, or maybe he didn't have anywhere else to go. But then, I started noticing things. It began with the way he looked at me. Sometimes I'd catch him staring. Not just a normal glance, but really staring. Like he was studying me, trying to figure something out. His eyes would lock onto mine, and he wouldn't look away until I did. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just socially awkward, I told myself. I've met people like that before, no big deal, but it didn't stop there. Every night, it got a little weirder. Mark would linger near my desk for no reason, just standing there, watching me work. When I asked if he needed something, he'd just smile, a thin, tight-lipped smile that never reached his eyes, and walk away. The unease in my stomach started to grow, but I didn't say anything. It's just the night shift messing with my head, I thought. Then, one night, I accidentally knocked into his locker. The door wasn't closed all the way, and it swung open when I hit it. I didn't mean to look inside, but something caught my eye. There were photos. At first, I didn't recognize them, but then I realized they were of me. Photos of me, taken from strange angles, some at work, some from outside. My stomach dropped. Next to the photos was a knife, a sharp, gleaming blade that looked out of place in an office. My hands shook as I reached for a notebook that was shoved in the back. I shouldn't have looked, but I couldn't stop myself. The pages were filled with ramblings, violent thoughts, descriptions of me, detailed in a way that made my skin crawl. I quickly shut the locker and stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront him? Go to the boss? But what if I was wrong? What if this was all just some sick joke? The fear gnawed at me, but I stayed quiet. Maybe if I ignored it, it would go away. But it didn't. Mark's behavior became more erratic. He started making comments, strange, cryptic things that didn't make sense but felt threatening. "It's almost time," he said one night, his voice low and flat. "Are you ready?" I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. I just nodded and tried to keep my distance, but it was like he was always there, hovering, watching. The office that once felt big now felt like a trap, with no way out. I started to lose sleep. I couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that knife, those photos. The tension was eating me alive, but still, I didn't say anything. What if it was all in my head? What if I was just imagining it? I couldn't trust my own thoughts anymore. I was spiraling, and I knew it, but I didn't know how to stop it. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront Mark. I waited until he left his desk and went to his locker, ready to expose whatever sick game he was playing. But when I opened it, it was empty. Completely empty, like nothing had ever been there. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. What was happening? Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? When Mark came back, I confronted him, my voice trembling. "What's going on, Mark? Where's all the stuff from your locker?" He just stared at me, his face expressionless. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice calm, too calm. "You must be seeing things." He walked past me, not another word, leaving me standing there, shaking with fear and confusion. I couldn't tell if he was messing with me or if I was truly going insane. That was the last night I worked there. I left the job, couldn't handle the stress anymore. But even after I left, the fear didn't go away. I started looking over my shoulder everywhere I went, half expecting to see Mark standing there, that blank expression on his face. I tried to move on, to forget about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that he was still out there, watching. Then, a few weeks later, I saw something on the news that made my blood run cold. A local woman had been found murdered, and the description of the crime scene matched the details in Mark's notebook. The knife, the way she was killed, everything. It was exactly like what I'd read in his notes. I didn't know what to think. Had it been real after all? Had I just walked away from a killer? I'll never know for sure, but I can't stop thinking about it. The fear still lingers. The feeling that Mark is still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And every time I see a shadow out of the corner of my eye or hear a noise I can't explain, I wonder if it's him. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. My shift had ended hours ago, but the call came in just as I was about to leave. "We're short on staff. Can you cover one more shift?" My body was exhausted, and I had plans to meet with some friends after work, but saying no wasn't an option. I needed the money, so I agreed. They told me I would only need to watch over one patient. Just one. It sounded easy enough. When I arrived at the room, it was darker than the others. The curtains were half drawn, blocking most of the dim light that filtered in from the hallway. The patient lay still in the bed, his face hidden under a blanket. A chart on the wall listed his name as John Doe. I asked the nurse why he didn't have a real name listed. She shrugged and said something about how he had been found unconscious on the street with no ID, and no one had come to claim him yet. It gave me a weird feeling, but I pushed it aside, thinking it was just another part of the job. The first few hours were quiet. I sat in the corner of the room, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. Every now and then, I glanced at the patient who hadn't moved an inch since I arrived. He was hooked up to machines that monitored his vitals, and everything seemed normal. Boring, even. I started to relax, thinking that this shift would be an easy one after all. But then, something caught my eye. It was a small movement, just a slight twitch of his finger. I blinked, wondering if I had imagined it. But no. There it was again. A faint, almost imperceptible movement. It was so subtle that it could easily be mistaken for a muscle spasm. I told myself that it was nothing, just a reflex. But the unease that had been gnawing at me since I walked into the room started to grow. As the night wore on, the movements became more frequent. His fingers twitched, his chest rose and fell in strange rhythms. And once, I swore I saw his head turn slightly on the pillow. I kept trying to convince myself that it was normal, that patients in comas sometimes moved without waking up. But each time it happened, I felt a little more unsettled, like something was deeply wrong. At one point, I stepped out into the hallway to take a break, needing a moment to clear my head. The fluorescent lights out there were harsh, a stark contrast to the dim room I had just left. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself that it was just the tiredness playing tricks on me. But when I returned to the room, I found the patient sitting up in bed. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. His back was turned to me, and he was staring straight ahead at the wall, motionless. I wanted to say something, to ask if he was okay, but my voice wouldn't come. The room felt colder, and the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Then, just as slowly as he had sat up, he lay back down, his body sinking into the mattress like nothing had happened. I stood there, paralyzed, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It wasn't possible. He was supposed to be unresponsive, in a coma. I should have called for help, but I didn't. I couldn't. I was too afraid that they would think I was crazy, that I was imagining things. So I kept quiet and returned to my chair, pretending that everything was fine. But things only got worse. The next time I looked at him, he was staring right at me, his eyes wide open. His gaze was empty, lifeless, but there was something in it that made my skin crawl. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. His eyes seemed to be pleading with me, begging me to understand something that I couldn't grasp. Suddenly, there was a noise, a soft shuffling sound, like bare feet on the cold hospital floor. I glanced around the room, but there was no one else there. The noise grew louder, more insistent, and it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. My heart raced, my breath quickened, but every time I turned my head, the patient was back in bed, his eyes closed, as if he had never moved. I was losing my grip on reality. I knew it. The fear was eating away at me, and I didn't know what to believe anymore. I couldn't trust my own senses. I was trapped in that room, with no one to turn to, and the night seemed endless. Finally, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront whatever was happening. I approached the bed, my hands trembling, and pulled back the curtain. The patient was standing by the window, his back to me, staring out into the darkness. I was about to scream when he slowly turned around to face me. His eyes were wide open, filled with a terror that sent chills down my spine. In a voice that was barely a whisper, he said, "They never leave." They watch us, even when we sleep. Before I could react, he collapsed onto the bed, lifeless once more. Panic surged through me, and I ran out of the room, shouting for help. When I returned with the doctor, the patient was back in bed, unresponsive, just like before. The doctor looked at me with concern, but I could tell he didn't believe a word I said. He told me to go home and rest, that I was just tired. I left the hospital that morning, shaken to my core. I didn't sleep that day, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those terrified eyes staring back at me. I quit the night shifts after that. I couldn't bear the thought of being alone in that darkness again. But the memory of that night stays with me, haunting me, and I still wonder, was it all in my head, or was there something more to that patient? Something I'll never understand. The deserted diner. I've been working the night shift at the diner for as long as I can remember. It's a lonely job, but I don't mind. The diner sits on the side of a quiet highway, the kind of place where truckers stop for coffee and a quick bite before hitting the road again. I'm used to the silence, broken only by the hum of the old neon sign and the occasional car passing by. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. The usual crowd was there. A couple of truckers, an old man nursing a cup of coffee, and a young couple sharing a plate of fries. I was in the kitchen, flipping burgers, when I noticed something strange. One by one, the customers started to leave. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just in a hurry. Maybe they had somewhere to be. But then, the old man, who usually stayed until closing, got up and walked out without even finishing his coffee. I wiped my hands on my apron and looked around the diner. It was empty, except for one man sitting at the counter. He was new, someone I'd never seen before. He was dressed in a dark coat, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Something about him made me uneasy, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I tried to ignore him and went back to work, hoping the uneasy feeling would pass. But it didn't. The air in the diner felt heavy, like a storm was coming. I could feel the man's eyes on me, watching my every move. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over to the counter, forcing a smile. "Can I get you anything?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the empty diner. The man looked up at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes were cold, almost empty, like he wasn't really there. He didn't smile back, just stared at me for what felt like an eternity before speaking. "You don't remember me, do you?" I froze. His voice was calm, too calm, like he knew something I didn't. I racked my brain, trying to place him, but nothing came. I shrugged, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've met." The man smiled then, a slow, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, we've met," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A long time ago. But you've changed since then." Something in his tone made my heart race. I wanted to get away from him, but I couldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, trapped by his gaze. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. "I think you've got the wrong guy," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice shook. The man didn't answer right away. He just kept smiling, that same cold smile, as if he was enjoying my discomfort. Then he leaned forward, his voice low and threatening. "You think you can forget? You think you can just move on and leave the past behind? But it doesn't work like that. The past has a way of catching up to you." My heart was pounding in my chest now. I didn't know what he was talking about, but I could feel the fear creeping in. He was playing with me, enjoying the fact that I was scared. I wanted to get away, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold, hard anger. "I want you to remember," he said, his voice like ice. "I want you to remember what you did." And then it hit me. The memory I'd buried so deep that I'd convinced myself it never happened. The accident, the dark road, the screech of tires, the sickening thud as I hit something or someone. I had been young, stupid, and scared. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, pretending it was a deer or a stray dog. But deep down, I knew. I knew it wasn't. The room seemed to spin as the memories came flooding back. I'd built my life around forgetting. But now, faced with this man, I couldn't deny it anymore. He knew. He knew everything. "I didn't mean to," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "I was just a kid. I was scared." The man's face was expressionless, his eyes hard as stone. "You didn't stop. You didn't call for help. You just left him there to die." I couldn't breathe. The walls of the diner were closing in on me, the air thick with the smell of grease and fear. "I'm sorry," I choked out, but even to me, the words sounded hollow. The man stood up, towering over me. His presence filled the room, suffocating me. "Sorry doesn't bring him back. Sorry doesn't make it right." I wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, but no words came out. I was drowning in guilt, in fear, in the knowledge that my past had finally caught up with me. The man turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in the silent diner. But before he reached the door, he stopped and looked back at me, his eyes piercing through the darkness. "You'll never forget now," he said, his voice low and cold. "You'll live with this for the rest of your life. Every time you close your eyes, every time you're alone, you'll remember." And with that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the empty diner, the weight of my guilt crushing me. I stood there, staring at the door, my mind racing. Was he real? Was any of this real? Or was it just my guilt finally breaking me? I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally moved, it was like waking from a nightmare. I walked to the door and looked out into the night, but the man was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Now, every night I stand in that same spot, waiting, watching, wondering if he'll come back, wondering if I'll ever be free of the past or if it will haunt me forever. I never liked working late, but I had no choice. My research was behind schedule, and the only way to catch up was to put in more hours. The lab was old, almost forgotten by most of the university. During the day, it felt normal enough, but at night, it became something else. The lights flickered sometimes, and the ventilation system made these odd noises, like it was breathing. Still, I pushed on, focused on my PhD project. I needed results, and I needed them fast. One night, I was organizing some old files and equipment, trying to clear space for my experiments. The lab was a mess, with dusty shelves and cabinets that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. That's when I found it, a small locked cabinet tucked away in a dark corner. I didn't think much of it at first, but something about it made me curious. Maybe it was the way it was hidden, or maybe I was just bored, looking for any excuse to take a break from my work. I grabbed a screwdriver and pried the cabinet open. It wasn't hard. The lock was old and rusty. Inside, I found a pile of dusty documents and a small sealed container. The documents looked old, too, like they hadn't been touched in decades. I brushed off the dust and started reading. What I found made my heart race. The documents described an experiment that had been shut down for ethical reasons. The details were vague, but it was clear that whatever they were working on wasn't normal. The experiment involved creating a biological organism, something that wasn't supposed to exist. The researchers had stopped their work abruptly, and it seemed like they had tried to cover it up. But why? And why was the experiment kept in this forgotten corner of the lab? Curiosity got the best of me. I knew I shouldn't, but I opened the container. Inside was something that I can only describe as alive. It was small, no bigger than my hand, but it moved in a way that made my skin crawl. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, partly organic, partly mechanical. I quickly sealed the container back up, my hands shaking. I spent the next few days trying to find out more about the experiment. I dug through the documents, searched the university's archives, and even tried asking some of the older faculty members about it. But no one seemed to know, or if they did, they weren't telling me. The more I researched, the more unsettled I became. It felt like I was being watched, like the lab was alive and aware of what I was doing. The equipment started malfunctioning, computers crashed, machines stopped working for no reason, and the strange noises from the ventilation grew louder. Then there were the smells, chemical, burnt, something rotting. They came and went, but each time they did, I felt like I was suffocating. I began to wonder if it was all in my head, if the stress was getting to me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Something was wrong with the lab, with that experiment, and I was in too deep to just walk away. One night, while I was working late again, I heard a noise from the storage area. It wasn't the usual hum of the machines or the creaking of the old building. This was different, soft but deliberate, like something moving. My heart pounded in my chest, but I had to see what it was. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the back of the lab. When I reached the storage area, I saw it. The creature from the experiment. The thing I had found in that container. Only now it was bigger, and it wasn't alone. It looked at me with eyes that were too human for something that was clearly not human. Its body was twisted, a mix of flesh and metal, and it moved toward me with a speed that didn't seem possible. Panic took over. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a metal pipe, and swung at it. The creature screeched, a sound that made my ears ring, but it didn't stop. It lunged at me, and I felt a sharp pain as it tore into my arm. I hit it again, harder this time, and it finally backed off, retreating into the shadows. My arm was bleeding badly, but I didn't stop to think. I ran out of the lab, locking the door behind me. I didn't care if the creature was still in there. I just needed to get away. I ran to my supervisor's office, but it was empty. The lights were off, and there was no sign of anyone. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I was alone, bleeding and terrified, with no idea what to do next. That's when I started to realize, maybe the university knew about the experiment all along. Maybe that's why the lab was so isolated, why no one seemed to care about what happened there. As I stumbled out of the building, I noticed something strange. The students I passed looked at me oddly, whispering to each other. The faculty members I saw seemed to avoid my gaze, like they knew something I didn't. It was like the entire campus was in on some secret that I wasn't supposed to know. I didn't go back to the lab after that. I couldn't. But I couldn't leave either. The university had its hooks in me, and I knew too much. Every day, I felt like I was being watched, like they were just waiting for me to slip up. I don't know what's going to happen to me, but I'm scared. I don't think I'll ever be safe again. Not with what I know, not with what they've done. I work the night shift at a small convenience store on the edge of town. It's not a bad job, just quiet. Sometimes the silence is too much, especially after midnight when the world feels dead. That's when my mind starts to play tricks on me. But lately, I'm not sure if it's just my mind. The store is mostly empty during my shift. Regulars drop by for cigarettes or snacks, but it's the kind of place where nobody stays long. At least, that's how it used to be. A couple of weeks ago, a new customer started showing up. He looked normal enough, a man in his 40s maybe, but something about him felt off. He'd come in around 2 a.m. every night, always the same time. At first I didn't pay much attention. People have their routines, right? He would walk through the aisles slowly, his eyes never really on the items. Sometimes he'd pick up something small like gum or a soda and come to the counter. He never said much, just handed over the money and left. But it was the way he looked at me that started to get under my skin. His eyes were too focused, too intense. It felt like he was studying me, but I told myself I was being paranoid. After the first week, I began to notice more strange things. He never came in when other customers were around. It was like he was waiting outside, watching, until the coast was clear. And he wasn't just walking through the aisles anymore. He would stand in spots where he could see me clearly, just staring as if trying to figure me out. I tried to ignore it, kept telling myself that I was overthinking things, but the feeling in my gut was getting harder to shake. One night, I decided to test a theory. When he walked in, I pretended to be busy stocking shelves in the back of the store. I kept an eye on him from the corner of my eye, trying to see what he would do. He didn't pick up anything this time. He just stood near the counter, staring at the empty spot where I usually stood. His head slowly turned, scanning the store like he was searching for something or someone. My heart raced. I ducked out of sight, crouching behind a shelf, trying to steady my breathing. After what felt like forever, I heard the door chime as he finally left. I told myself I had to do something. Maybe I should call the police, but what would I say? That a guy was looking at me weird? They'd think I was crazy. I thought about telling my manager, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or unfit for the job, so I tried to brush it off. But every night, the fear came back, stronger. The worst night was when he finally spoke to me. He came in as usual, his eyes locked on me from the moment he entered. This time, he walked straight to the counter without pretending to browse. He leaned in a little too close and smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He asked in a low voice how my night was going. I mumbled something about it being quiet, trying to act normal, but he didn't stop there. "You must get lonely working these hours," he said, his voice calm, like we were having a friendly chat. "I see you here every night, all alone." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I forced a smile, trying to end the conversation, but he kept talking. "Do you ever get scared? You know, being out here by yourself? It's not the safest place, you know? Anything could happen." The way he looked at me when he said that, like he knew something I didn't, made my blood run cold. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel the fear rising in my chest. I stammered that I wasn't scared, trying to laugh it off. His smile widened. "Good," he said. And then he leaned in even closer, his voice barely a whisper. "You should be careful. Some people might be watching." He left without another word, leaving me frozen behind the counter. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the cash register open. The rest of the night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. When my shift finally ended, I rushed to my car, my eyes scanning the empty parking lot for any sign of him. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in my apartment, every passing car made me jump. I kept replaying his words in my head, wondering what he meant. Was he really watching me? Was he just trying to scare me? I didn't know what to think anymore. The next night, I almost called in sick. I didn't want to see him again, didn't want to feel those eyes on me, but I couldn't afford to lose the job. So I went back, dreading the moment when he would walk through the door. When he didn't show up at his usual time, I felt a small sense of relief, but it didn't last long. As I was closing up, getting ready to turn off the lights, I saw something outside. In the dark parking lot, Under one of the flickering streetlights, a shadow moved. It was him. He was standing there, just outside the circle of light, watching me. He didn't move, didn't try to come in. He just stood there, like he was waiting for something. I quickly locked the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel his eyes on me as I grabbed my things and hurried out the back exit, not daring to look back. Now, every time I work the night shift, I'm on edge, waiting for him to show up. I don't know what he wants, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching, waiting for the right moment to make his next move. I've been working as a night shift security guard at a parking garage for a few years now. It's a quiet job, mostly uneventful, and I usually just spend my nights checking cameras, walking through empty floors, and listening to the hum of fluorescent lights. The garage is in a quiet part of town where nothing much ever happens. That's how I liked it, until recently. It was about a week ago when I first noticed the van. It was a plain white van, unmarked, parked in a dark corner of the garage. It caught my eye because it hadn't moved in a few days, which was strange. Most people only park here for a few hours or overnight at most. But this van just sat there, day after day. There was something about it that felt off. At first, I didn't think too much of it. Maybe someone forgot about it, or maybe it broke down. But the more I looked at it on the cameras, the more uneasy I felt. I tried to push the feeling away, telling myself I was being paranoid, but that nagging feeling wouldn't leave. Finally, one night, curiosity got the best of me. I decided to check it out up close. It was around 2 a.m. and the garage was empty, just how it usually is. I grabbed my flashlight and walked over to the van. As I got closer, I noticed how old and beat up it looked. There were scratches and dents all over, like it had been through a lot. The windows were heavily tinted, so I couldn't see inside. I walked around it, shining my light on the back. The doors were locked, but the handles had been reinforced with thick metal bars. That was weird. Why would someone need to secure the doors like that? Then, I caught a whiff of something foul. It was faint, but unmistakable. A smell like rotten food or something worse. My stomach turned, but I told myself it was probably just garbage someone left inside. Still, the smell stuck with me, even after I walked away. I tried to ignore it for a couple more nights, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. So, the next night, I made up my mind to see what was inside. I know, I probably shouldn't have, but I needed to know. I grabbed a set of old tools we keep in the office, just in case, and headed back to the van. My hands were shaking as I worked on the lock. It took a few minutes, but eventually, I managed to pry it open. When the door finally swung open, I felt a cold rush of air hit me, and that smell was stronger now, almost making me gag. I aimed my flashlight inside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The inside of the van was like a prison. There were metal bars welded to the sides, creating a cage. Chains hung from the walls, and the floor was covered with filthy, stained blankets. It was clear that someone, maybe more than one person, had been kept inside. The ropes and chains looked like they had been used recently. My mind started racing. This wasn't just an abandoned vehicle. This was a mobile prison. People had been trapped in here, and judging by the smell, maybe worse. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing. That's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps echoing through the garage. Someone was coming. My blood turned to ice. Whoever owned this van might be here, right now. I quickly shut the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. My hands were trembling so much that I almost dropped the lock. I managed to secure it just as the footsteps got closer. There wasn't time to think. I slipped away into the shadows, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I crouched behind a pillar, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps grew louder, then stopped near the van. My mind was racing with panic. What if they found me? What if they knew I had opened the van? I stayed completely still, waiting for what felt like an eternity. Then the footsteps started moving again, this time away from the van, getting quieter until they were gone. I didn't move until I was sure they were gone. When I finally felt safe enough to come out, I rushed back to the security office and called the police. My hands were still shaking as I tried to explain what I had found. They told me they would send someone over right away, but even as I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. The police arrived within minutes and I led them to the van, but when we got there, it was gone. Just like that, it had vanished, as if it had never been there. The officers looked at me like I was crazy, but I knew what I had seen. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't believe me. I could barely sleep after that, my mind replaying the images of that cage, those chains. The next night I returned to work, and the parking garage felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier. I couldn't stop myself from checking every corner, expecting that van to be back. But it wasn't, and that's almost worse. I keep thinking about who or what was inside it and where it is now. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. Even now, I'm sitting here in the security office, watching the cameras, but my eyes keep drifting back to that dark corner where the van had been. I know it's gone, but I can't shake the feeling that it, or whoever was driving it, might come back. I didn't want to take the night shift, but when Matt quit without warning, they didn't give me much choice. I needed the money, and it was either this or get on the bad side of my boss. Matt always seemed like a solid guy, dependable, and never complained. So, when he just disappeared, no one really understood. He must have found a better job, I told myself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that settled in my gut. But something about it didn't sit right with me. When I arrived at the factory for my first night shift, it was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. The factory was an old, creaky building, the type that had been around forever and seemed like it might fall apart at any moment. I was shown around, introduced to the routine tasks. Nothing special, just keep an eye on the machines, make sure everything is running smoothly. It was simple work, but the emptiness of the place gnawed at me. As the night dragged on, I started to notice little things. Matt's locker was still open, and some of his stuff was still inside. His coat, a half-empty bottle of water, a book with a bookmark still in the middle. It was like he left in a hurry. But why? It wasn't like Matt to leave things behind. He was always so careful, so precise. My thoughts kept drifting back to a conversation we had a few weeks before. He seemed off, more anxious than usual, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Now, I was starting to wonder if I missed something important. I tried to focus on my work, but I kept hearing these faint noises. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling. You know, creaks and groans that old places like this make. But then I started hearing other sounds, like something was moving in the shadows. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But the feeling that something was wrong kept growing stronger. A few hours into the shift, I decided to take a break. I went over to where Matt used to work, just to see if there were any clues. I didn't expect to find anything, but there it was. A note, crumpled up and shoved under a pile of papers. The handwriting was rushed, almost like he was in a hurry to get the words down. It wasn't much, just a few words. Something is wrong, can't stay, too dangerous. That was all. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I could feel the sweat starting to form on my forehead. What the hell did Matt get into? The more I looked around, the more things seemed out of place. Tools were scattered on the floor, like someone had been in a rush to leave. And there were marks on the floor, like something heavy had been dragged. My mind was racing, trying to piece it all together. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the evidence was stacking up. Matt didn't leave on his own. Something happened to him, and I had a sinking feeling that I might be next. I decided to do a full check of the factory, hoping to find more clues. As I walked through the dimly lit halls, I noticed a door I hadn't seen before. It was tucked away in a corner, almost like it was meant to be hidden. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, unsure if I really wanted to know what was inside. The door creaked open, revealing a small, cramped room. And there it was. Matt's stuff, all of it. His phone, his wallet, even his lunch from that day, untouched. No one leaves their phone behind, not unless they're forced to. Panic started to set in. I fumbled for my own phone, trying to call my supervisor, but no one answered. I tried again and again, but each time the call went straight to voicemail. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I was trapped in this place, and the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Matt didn't quit. He didn't leave voluntarily. Someone or something made sure he couldn't. I had to get out of there. I started running, but the factory's layout, once so familiar, now felt like a maze. Every turn I made seemed to lead me deeper into the building, away from any exits. The noises were getting louder now, more distinct. It wasn't just the building settling. It was something else, something that was getting closer. I could feel it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, the cold sweat trickling down my back. I was in real danger, and there was no one around to help. Finally, I saw a light in the distance, what looked like an exit. Relief washed over me as I sprinted toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. But just as I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, too scared to turn around. I could feel someone or something right behind me, its presence heavy in the air. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was trapped, just like Matt. I don't know what happened next. All I remember is turning around and then nothing. When I woke up, I was outside, lying on the cold, hard ground. The factory was locked up tight, no sign that anyone had been inside. But I know what I saw, what I felt. Something happened in that factory, something that took Matt and almost took me too. I don't work the night shift anymore, and I don't go near that place. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps, and I wonder if whatever was in there is still waiting for its next victim. I work as a night receptionist at a small hotel in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place that gets maybe 1 or 2 guests on a good night. It's usually dead quiet, which is why I took the job in the first place. I like the silence, the way the hours just drift by, nothing but the soft hum of the lobby lights and the occasional creak from the old wooden floors. But last night, something happened that I can't shake off. The shift started like any other. The hotel was nearly empty, just one older couple on the second floor. The third floor, where room 314 is located, was completely vacant. It had been that way for weeks. We didn't even bother cleaning it much since no one stayed there, and there was no point in wasting time. The air felt heavy, though, more so than usual. Maybe it was the storm outside. The wind was howling, making the windows rattle like they were about to break. I was half asleep at the desk when the phone rang. The sound made me jump, breaking the silence. It was a request for room service. Nothing weird about that, except it was coming from room 314. I stared at the phone for a second, trying to remember if I'd somehow missed a booking, but the computer screen was clear. Room 314 was supposed to be empty. I figured it was a glitch. The system wasn't the most reliable, and sometimes calls got misrouted. But something nagged at me, like a tiny itch I couldn't scratch. I decided to call the room, just to check. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I was about to hang up when someone answered. At first, I couldn't hear anything, just some muffled sounds like the person was far away from the phone. Then, a voice, faint and scratchy, said, "I need help." The line went dead. I sat there, staring at the receiver. That voice didn't sound right, like something was off. It was too quiet, too distant. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't explain why. I knew I had to check the room, even though every part of me was screaming to just ignore it, to sit back down and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I couldn't do that. The walk to the 3rd floor felt longer than usual. The hallways were dark, and the old carpet muffled my footsteps. As I got closer to room 314, the air seemed colder, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept going. The door to room 314 was ajar. That was against hotel policy. We always locked the doors when a room wasn't in use. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. Inside, the room was dim, the only light coming from the small lamp by the bed. And there he was, a man sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. He didn't move, didn't even seem to notice me. He looked terrible. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his hair a mess. Dark circles hung under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. I couldn't figure out how he got there. The door had been locked, the room unbooked, and yet here he was. I forced myself to speak, asking him how he got into the room, if he was a guest. The man finally looked at me, his eyes unfocused. "I've been here for a while," he said, his voice flat, empty. That made no sense. There was no record of him, no sign that anyone had stayed in that room. I didn't know what to do. My skin crawled and my mind raced. I decided to get security. They could handle this, not me. I backed out of the room and hurried downstairs, my heart pounding. When I got to the security office, I explained everything as best I could. The security guard, a big guy named Dan, looked at me like I was crazy, but he agreed to check it out. We went back to room 314 together, but when we got there, the door was closed and locked, just like it should have been. Dan opened it with his master key, and the room was empty. No sign of the man, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The bed was made. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, and everything was in perfect order. It was like he had never existed. Dan shrugged it off, said maybe I was tired and imagining things. But I knew what I saw. I knew that man had been there, sitting on the bed, staring at the wall. Back in the lobby, I checked the guest records again, going over every detail. Nothing. There was no entry for room 314, no guest unaccounted for, and the security footage showed nothing either. No one had entered or left that room all night. I finished my shift, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The whole thing felt wrong, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Even now, a day later, I can't shake the feeling that something is terribly wrong. The staff is talking, whispering about room 314. They say strange things happen there sometimes, but no one knows why. Some say it's just stories to scare the new employees, but after last night, I'm not so sure. I haven't told anyone else what I saw, but I can't stop thinking about it. The room key for 314 is still sitting on my desk, and every time I look at it, I wonder if I should ever work the night shift again. Maybe some things are better left alone. I've been on the night shift for years, patrolling this same stretch of highway. It's mostly quiet out here, just the hum of my cruiser and the occasional headlights breaking the darkness. Sometimes It feels like I'm the only person alive in the world driving through this endless void. But last night, something happened that I can't shake. I'm not even sure I believe it myself. It was just after midnight, and I was cruising down the highway, eyes half on the road, half on the clock, counting the hours until my shift ended. The sky was pitch black, with no moon or stars in sight, just an oppressive darkness that swallowed everything. My radio crackled with static, the usual background noise, but nothing else. A typical night, or so I thought. Then I saw it. A car ahead, swerving from one lane to another. At first, I figured it was a drunk driver. It wouldn't be the first time I had to pull someone over for that. So I flipped on my lights and pulled up behind them. The car slowed down, almost hesitantly, and finally came to a stop on the shoulder. I approached the car, hand on my flashlight, ready to give a stern lecture. But when I got to the window, the driver's face stopped me cold. He was pale, drenched in sweat, and his eyes were wide with terror. He didn't look drunk. He looked scared out of his mind. "Officer?" He gasped, his voice shaking. "Someone's chasing me." I glanced back at the highway. Nothing but empty roads stretching out into the night. No cars, no headlights, just blackness. I turned back to him, trying to keep my voice calm. "There's no one out here, sir. You're the only car on the road." He shook his head, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. No, they were right behind me. I saw their headlights. They were tailgating me for miles. But when you pulled me over, they disappeared. I swear, they were there." I wanted to dismiss it, chalk it up to nerves or exhaustion. Maybe he was tired, imagining things. But something about his fear, the raw panic in his eyes, made me pause. I looked back at the road again, searching for any sign of another car. But there was nothing. Just that suffocating darkness. I tried to reassure him, but he wasn't having it. He kept insisting that someone had been following him, that he wasn't crazy, that he'd seen the headlights right there in his mirror. The more he talked, the more agitated he became, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. I started to feel uneasy myself. The night was too quiet, too still, like the world was holding its breath. My eyes kept darting back to the road, expecting to see something, anything, but there was only emptiness. I decided it was best to get him on his way, but as I turned to leave, I saw it. A flash of light in my rearview mirror. My heart skipped a beat. Headlights, far off in the distance, but getting closer, fast. I spun around, expecting to see a car racing towards us, but when I looked back, the road was empty. The lights were gone. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the road, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The driver was right, but how could that be? There was no car, no sound, nothing to explain those lights. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Something wasn't right. I walked back to the driver, trying to hide my own unease. "I saw the lights," I admitted, my voice sounding hollow even to myself. "But there's no car. I don't know what's going on, but I think it's best if you head home." He nodded, still shaking, and I could see the relief in his eyes. But as he started his engine, I caught another glimpse of those headlights in my mirror, closer this time. My stomach dropped. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something I could explain away. Then it hit me. A few weeks ago, there had been reports of a car causing accidents on this highway. Several people had died, but no one ever found the car responsible. The survivors all said the same thing. They saw headlights coming at them at high speed, and then nothing. The car was gone. I had dismissed it as just panic, a trick of the light, but now I wasn't so sure. I decided I couldn't let the driver go alone. "I'll escort you to the nearest exit," I told him, trying to sound confident. But inside, I was shaking. I got back into my cruiser and pulled up behind him, keeping my eyes glued to the road behind us. We drove in silence, both of us on edge, and that's when it happened. The lights appeared again, this time so close I could almost feel them. They were moving erratically, swerving like they were out of control, getting closer and closer to the back of my cruiser. My hands tightened on the wheel. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick, a hallucination. But it felt real, too real. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished. Gone, as if they had never been there. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely breathe. What the hell was happening? I glanced at the driver's car, and I could see him looking back at me in his mirror, his face pale and frightened. He had seen them too. We finally reached the exit, and I pulled over, watching as the driver sped off into the distance. I sat there for a long time, staring at the road, half expecting those lights to come back. But they didn't. The night was silent again, the highway empty. I don't know what I saw out there, and I don't know if I'll ever understand it. But now, every time I'm on that stretch of highway, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, waiting. Maybe one day, those lights will come back for me too. And when they do, I wonder if anyone will believe my story. The locked door. Working the night shift as a security guard in an old office building isn't exactly exciting. Most nights, it's just me, the endless rows of empty cubicles, and the occasional flicker of a fluorescent light. The building is mostly quiet, almost too quiet. Sometimes I hear creaks and groans echoing through the hallways, but I've always figured it's just the old structure settling. I've never let it bother me before. But last week, something was different. I was making my usual rounds, checking each floor like I always do. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it, something strange coming from one of the upper floors. It wasn't the usual creak or groan. It was a faint shuffling, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. My first thought was that someone was in the building who shouldn't be, maybe a squatter or a late-night intruder. But the sound, it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't seem right. At first I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the sound kept coming. It was persistent, like it wanted me to notice. I felt uneasy, but I knew I had to check it out. It's my job, after all. So, I headed to the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. As the elevator doors opened, I felt a cold draft hit me. The air on this floor was different, heavier, and there was a strange smell, stale, like old paper and dust. I stepped out into the hallway, and right away, I noticed something odd. One of the doors, which I knew should be closed, was slightly ajar. I hesitated, but the shuffling sound seemed louder now, coming from behind that door. I walked slowly towards it, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest, each step echoing in the silence. When I reached the door, I pushed it open and shone my light inside. The room was empty, just rows of filing cabinets and old office furniture covered in dust. But something didn't feel right. The smell was stronger here, and I noticed footprints in the dust on the floor. They were fresh, leading towards a door at the back of the room that I'd never noticed before. I studied the blueprints of the building when I started this job. I knew every room, every corridor, but this door wasn't supposed to be here. It was old, the wood rotting, and the paint peeling off. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten and hidden away. But how could I have missed it? I pulled out my key ring, trying several keys before finding one that fit. The lock clicked open, and the door creaked as it swung inward. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The room was small, cramped, with low ceilings and walls lined with more old furniture and stacks of yellowing papers. But there was something else. A broken chair in the center of the room, ropes hanging loosely from its arms and legs, as if someone had been tied there. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. When the light came back on, I noticed something else. A hidden compartment in the floor, slightly ajar. I knelt down and pried it open. Inside were old photos, personal belongings, and what looked like a journal. The photos were faded, showing a young woman, her face scared, her eyes pleading. The journal was filled with frantic, messy handwriting, pages describing being held captive, begging for help. My hands shook as I read, the words blurring together in my panic. Suddenly, the shuffling noise came again, this time from the hallway just outside the room. It was closer now, too close. I dropped the journal and stood up quickly, my mind racing. Someone else was here. Someone who didn't want me to find this room, this evidence. I had to get out. I turned to leave, but the door, which had been easy to open before, was now stuck. I pulled and tugged, but it wouldn't budge. The shuffling noise was right outside the door now, and I could hear slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I banged on the door, trying to force it open, but it was no use. I was trapped. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, the door began to creak, slowly opening from the outside. I froze, my flashlight flickering again. In the dim light, I could see a shadow stretching across the floor, long and thin, reaching towards me. I backed up against the wall, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything. But my body wouldn't move. The door opened fully, but no one stepped inside. Instead, the room was filled with that awful smell again, stronger this time, suffocating. My flashlight finally gave out, plunging the room into darkness. All I could hear was my own panicked breathing and the slow, deliberate creak of the door. And then, nothing. I don't remember much after that. I woke up hours later, lying on the floor of the same office room. The door was wide open, and there was no sign of anyone else. The room looked untouched, like I had imagined everything. But I know what I saw, what I felt. I quit the next day, handed in my keys, and left that building for good. I've heard stories since then, rumors about that floor, about strange disappearances and hidden rooms. But no one believes me. They think I'm just another guard who got spooked on the night shift. But I know the truth. I know what's behind that locked door, and I'll never go back. I work the night shift at a call center. It's a job that feels like time moves slower than it should, especially after midnight. The office is always quiet, almost too quiet, with nothing but the hum of computers and the occasional creak from the old building. It's the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I've gotten used to it over the years. Most calls are routine, people asking about their bills, account problems, things like that. Nothing exciting ever happens. But that night, something different happened. Something that still haunts me. It was just after midnight, and I was trying to keep myself awake, scrolling through my phone between calls. Then, the phone rang. The number was unknown, but that wasn't unusual. I answered like I always do, expecting another boring question about a bill. But the voice on the other end wasn't asking about bills. It was shaky, almost like a whisper, and what it said made my heart skip a beat. "Help me," the voice said. "I'm trapped. He won't let me go." I froze for a second, my brain struggling to catch up with what I was hearing. The voice was weak, like the person was struggling to speak. They went on to describe a dark, confined space. It sounded like a nightmare, and I didn't know if it was real or if someone was playing a sick joke on me. "Where are you?" I asked, trying to stay calm. The person gave me a vague description of a place that sounded familiar, a warehouse not far from where I was. But before I could ask more, the line went dead. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. Was it real? Was someone really in danger? Or was it just a prank? We got pranks all the time, and our supervisor always warned us not to take them seriously. But this didn't feel like a prank. There was something in the voice, something desperate that I couldn't ignore. I thought about calling the police, but then I hesitated. What if it wasn't real? What if I was wasting their time? I could already hear my supervisor's voice in my head, telling me I'd been duped by some bored kid. But what if it was real? What if someone needed help, and I just ignored it? I sat there for what felt like forever, battling with myself. In the end, curiosity and a sense of responsibility won. I decided to check it out myself. If it turned out to be nothing, I'd just go back to work and forget about it. I grabbed my keys and left the office. The streets were empty, the kind of empty that makes you feel like you're in a ghost town. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a huge mistake, but I kept going. The warehouse wasn't far, just a few minutes away. When I got there, it looked exactly like how the voice had described, a rundown, abandoned building that hadn't seen life in years. Even in daylight, it would have looked dangerous, but at night, it was something out of a horror movie. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the building. Everything inside me was telling me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. What if someone was really in there? I had to at least check. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty space. Inside, it was pitch black. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight, and started to move deeper into the building. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, like the darkness was trying to pull me back. As I walked, I thought I heard something, a faint sound, maybe footsteps, or breathing. I couldn't tell. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct was screaming at me to leave. But I kept going, driven by the thought that someone might need help. Finally, I reached a small room at the back of the warehouse. The door was heavy, almost like it didn't want to open. I pushed it with all my strength, and when it finally gave way, my stomach dropped. The room was empty. Completely empty, except for a broken phone lying on the floor. The screen was cracked, and it looked like it had been used recently. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Relief washed over me for a moment. Maybe it was just a prank after all. But then, a cold realization hit me. If the phone was here, then so was the person who called. But where were they now? The relief I felt quickly turned to dread. I bent down to pick up the phone, my hand shaking when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from behind me. My heart stopped. I turned around, but the flashlight in my hand flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and my mind raced with possibilities. Who was it? What did they want? My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The last thing I remember was the sound of those footsteps, echoing through the empty warehouse, as I turned to face whatever was behind me. I wish I could say what happened next, but I can't. Everything went dark, and the next thing I knew, I was back in my car, drenched in sweat, with no memory of how I got there. I don't know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just a prank, a sick joke to scare the night shift worker. Or maybe, just maybe, there was someone in that warehouse, someone I never got to see. All I know is that I've never been back to that call center, and I never will. Some things are better left unknown. I've been working the night shift at a factory for almost 2 years now. The routine is always the same: clock in, do the work, clock out. The factory is a huge place, cold and dark, with machines that never stop humming. Most of the time, it's just me and a few other workers. We barely talk. Everyone is focused on getting through the shift. But lately, I noticed something strange about one of my coworkers, John. He's been acting differently. John was never the chatty type, but he used to at least say hello or nod when we crossed paths. Now, he's mostly silent, and when he does talk, his voice is quiet, almost like he's afraid of being heard. The weirdest thing, though, is that John keeps disappearing. He leaves his station for long periods and comes back looking different, pale, nervous, like something bad happened while he was gone. At first, I thought maybe he was just tired or sick, but it started happening more often. Each time he returned, he seemed more distant, more scared. One night, I couldn't stop thinking about where John might be going during those absences. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept wandering back to John. I kept telling myself it was none of my business, but the curiosity was too strong. So, I started paying closer attention to him, watching him out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't long before I noticed a pattern. Every few hours, John would glance around like he was making sure no one was watching, and then he'd quietly slip away. He always returned the same way, pale, trembling, and avoiding everyone's eyes. It was like he was a different person each time he came back, someone more haunted. I didn't want to get involved, but I couldn't help myself. One night, when John disappeared again, I decided to follow him. I told myself it was just to satisfy my curiosity, that I'd follow him for a bit and then go back to work. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I had to know what was going on. I waited until John made his move, then quietly trailed behind him. The factory is like a maze at night, with long, dark corridors and shadowy corners. I had to be careful not to make any noise, but my heart was pounding so loud I was sure he'd hear it. I followed him through the factory until he reached a part of the building I'd never been to before, a place that was almost forgotten. He slipped into a room at the far end of the corridor, and I crept closer, trying to stay hidden. There was a crack in the door, just wide enough for me to see inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Inside the room, John was meeting with a group of men dressed in suits. They didn't belong here. They looked out of place in the dirty, worn-out factory. John handed them something that looked like a stack of files. One of the men opened a briefcase and gave John an envelope. I couldn't see what was inside, but the way John's hands shook as he took it told me enough. I realized then that John was involved in something dangerous, something illegal. My first thought was to run back and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but my feet felt glued to the spot. I watched as the men left, one by one, until it was just John, standing there with the envelope in his hand, looking more terrified than ever. I stayed hidden until John finally left the room, then quietly made my way back to my station. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just seen. I knew I should forget about it, but the images kept replaying in my head. The next day when I saw John, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I had to know the truth. When I confronted him, his face went pale, and he looked like he was going to faint. He begged me to forget what I'd seen, saying he had no choice. He told me that those men had threatened his family, that they'd hurt them if he didn't do what they wanted. He was in too deep, and there was no way out. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to help him, but I was scared for myself too. What if they came after me if they found out I knew? The fear gnawed at me, making it hard to think straight. The next night, John disappeared again, but this time he didn't come back. The factory was searched, but there was no trace of him. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. The other workers didn't seem to notice, or maybe they just didn't care. but I knew something terrible had happened to him. I haven't slept well since that night. I keep thinking about our last conversation, about the fear in John's eyes. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that those men know I saw too much. I try to convince myself that I'm just being paranoid, but the unease never goes away. Sometimes I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of those men standing there, waiting. I can't go back to the factory. I'm too scared of what might happen. But even at home, the fear follows me. I can't escape it. I don't know what happened to John. I don't know if he's still alive or if they got rid of him. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget the look on his face when he begged me to forget. And I know I'll never feel safe again. I've been working the night shift at this small pharmacy for a few years now. It's usually quiet, with the same old customers coming in for their late-night prescriptions. Nothing exciting ever happens, which is fine by me. But lately, things have started to change. More people are coming in, and they all seem to be asking for the same medication, a drug I've rarely sold before. It's not something common like painkillers or sleeping pills. This medication is specific, usually prescribed for a very particular condition, but suddenly, everyone seems to need it. It started with just one or two people. They came in late, after midnight, when the streets are empty and nobody is around. These customers were always in a hurry, avoiding eye contact, mumbling something about a doctor's recommendation. I didn't think much of it at first. People get embarrassed sometimes. Maybe they didn't want to talk about their health issues. But then more people started coming in, asking for the same thing. Every night a different person, but always the same nervous behavior, the same quick exit after getting what they wanted. It made me curious, so I looked up the drug in more detail. What I found didn't sit right with me. It's often used for treating certain mental health conditions, but in the wrong hands, it can be used for something else, something illegal, something dangerous. That's when I started getting worried. Why would so many people need this drug, and why would they all come to my pharmacy? I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going on. So, I began to keep track of these customers. I wrote down descriptions of them, their clothes, their faces, anything I could remember. Some of them looked familiar, like I'd seen them somewhere before, maybe on TV or in the news. But I couldn't be sure. As the nights went on, my paranoia grew. I started noticing other strange things. Some customers seemed to recognize each other. They didn't talk, but they'd exchange quick glances or small gestures, like they were communicating in some secret code. I even saw one guy slip something into another customer's pocket before they both left. My heart was racing every time the door opened, wondering what would happen next. I couldn't let it go. I needed to know what was happening. I spent hours on the internet, searching through news articles, forums, anything that might give me a clue. That's when I found it. A string of missing persons cases, all from neighborhoods near my pharmacy. The articles didn't connect the dots, but I did. These people were last seen near my store, and now I was sure the customers I'd been seeing were involved somehow. But how? And why? My mind was spinning with possibilities, none of them good. Then, one night, someone different walked in. It was around 2 a.m., and the store was empty except for me. This customer wasn't like the others. They were calm, too calm, with a confidence that made my skin crawl. They walked up to the counter, looked me straight in the eye, and asked for the medication. My hand started shaking as I reached for the box. Something about this person made me feel like they knew what I had been doing, like they could see through me. The silence between us was heavy, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I just give them the medication and hope they leave? Or should I ask questions, try to find out more? But before I could decide, the customer leaned in closer, their voice barely above a whisper. They said something that sent a chill down my spine. "You've been asking a lot of questions, haven't you?" My breath caught in my throat. How did they know? Had they been watching me? Were they part of whatever was going on? The fear I'd been feeling for weeks finally took hold of me, freezing me in place. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The customer smiled, a cold, knowing smile, and took the medication from my hand. "Be careful," they said, turning to leave. "You might not like what you find." As they walked out the door, I stood there, paralyzed by fear. What did they mean by that? Were they threatening me? Was I in danger? The questions raced through my mind, but there were no answers. Only the cold, empty silence of the store. I wanted to run, to get out of there and never look back. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, my heart hammering in my chest. Then the phone rang. The sound shattered the silence, making me jump. I stared at it, my hand hovering over the receiver, terrified of who might be on the other end. Was it them? Was it a warning or something worse? I didn't know if I should answer or let it ring. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't listen. And that's where I'm stuck, caught between the fear of what I've uncovered and the terror of what might happen next. I don't know who to trust, or if I can even trust myself anymore. All I know is that something dark is happening, and I'm in too deep. I just wish I had never started asking questions. The emergency room, a night I can't forget. Working the night shift in the ER can be boring and exhausting at the same time. It's usually filled with the same kinds of cases: drunk people with cuts, minor car accidents, and old folks needing attention for their chronic diseases. I've been doing this job long enough that nothing really surprises me anymore. The tired nurses shuffle around, doctors give orders, and I just try to make it through the night without losing my mind. But that night was different. It started like any other. We had a few patients come in, nothing unusual, just the regular city chaos. But then, around 2 a.m., a young man was brought in by a couple of police officers. He looked scared. No, terrified. His clothes were torn, and his eyes were wild. He kept looking around like someone was chasing him. One of the officers told me the guy was found wandering the streets, claiming someone was after him, trying to take his organs. At first, I thought it was just another drug-induced panic. It wasn't rare to see people coming in, paranoid and out of their minds from whatever substance they had taken. The nurse rolled her eyes when I told her what he'd said. She didn't take it seriously. Neither did I at first. But when I looked at him again, I felt uneasy. There was something about the way he kept whispering, "They're coming. They're coming for me." His voice was low and shaky, like he was too scared to even say it out loud. I could feel the fear radiating off him. He wasn't just high, he was genuinely terrified. I should have done something then, but I hesitated. Maybe I didn't want to believe that what he was saying could be true. The doctor ordered a psych evaluation, standard procedure for someone in his condition. We put him in one of the waiting rooms, and he just sat there, twitching and glancing at the door every few seconds. I told myself he was just paranoid, that he'd calm down once the meds kicked in. An hour passed, and then a group of people came into the ER. 3 men and a woman, all dressed too nicely for this part of town. They said they were his family. I don't know why, but I immediately felt something was off. They were too calm, too controlled, and they didn't even seem concerned about him. They asked where he was and acted as if they already knew the answer. I pointed them to the room where the young man was waiting, and as soon as he saw them, he started to panic. He tried to get up, but his legs seemed too weak. The way he looked at them, it was pure fear. I told the doctor that his so-called family was here, and she didn't think twice before letting them go in. The nurse next to me mumbled, "Poor guy, must have had a rough time on the streets." But I could see she didn't care much. Everyone here was just doing their job, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The man had gone pale as soon as the group entered the room, and I caught a glimpse of him backing up against the wall, shaking his head and whispering, "Please, no. Don't let them take me." The doctor and nurses ignored him. They had other patients to worry about, and to them, he was just another crazy person with a wild story. But I was starting to believe him. I don't know why, but something in my gut told me that these people were not his family, and whatever they wanted from him, it wasn't good. I was about to say something when one of the men grabbed the young man's arm. The guy screamed, a raw, desperate sound that cut through the noise of the ER. It made me freeze, but no one else seemed to notice. The strangers whispered something to him, too low for me to hear, and then he collapsed, just like that. He hit the floor and I rushed over, but the woman pushed me away, saying they would take care of him. "We'll take him home," she said, in a voice that was too sweet to be real. I looked at the doctor, expecting her to object, but she just nodded, not really paying attention. They were getting ready to move him, and I felt this overwhelming sense of guilt and fear. What if he was telling the truth? What if they were really going to take his organs? I had to do something. My mind was racing, and I didn't know who to trust. I managed to stall them by asking some questions, pretending I needed to check the paperwork, but my hands were shaking. I quietly called for security, my heart pounding in my chest, praying that they would get here in time. I knew I was overstepping, but I couldn't just let them take him. But before security could even reach the ER, they were gone. The young man, the strangers, they vanished as if they had never been there. No one saw them leave, and there was no sign of them anywhere. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I stared at the empty room where he had been lying just moments before. The sense of dread was almost suffocating. The security guards arrived a few minutes later, looking annoyed and confused. I tried to explain what happened, but it sounded crazy even to me. They told me to go back to work, that there was nothing they could do now. I stood there, feeling the weight of what I'd just let happen. I could have stopped them. I could have saved him. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't focus, couldn't think about anything but the look of sheer terror in that young man's eyes. I keep telling myself I didn't have a choice, that it wasn't my fault, but deep down I know the truth. I let them take him, and now I'll never know what happened to him. But I can't shake the feeling that I'll be haunted by that night for the rest of my life. I've been driving trucks for almost 20 years now, and I've seen my share of strange things on the road, but nothing, absolutely nothing prepared me for that night at the rest stop. I don't talk about it much because, honestly, it still messes with my head. But maybe writing it down will help. It was just another long haul, like so many before. I was driving through a stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., the kind of time where everything feels dead quiet, and you can only hear the hum of the engine and the tires on the pavement. I'd been driving for hours, and I needed to stretch my legs and maybe grab a quick nap. I saw a sign for a rest stop ahead and decided to pull in. When I arrived, the place was empty except for one car, a beat-up old sedan parked near the entrance. At first, I didn't think much of it. You see cars like that all the time, people leaving them overnight while they catch some sleep inside or waiting for help. I parked my rig a little farther down, away from the car, and got out. The air was cold, and there was a slight fog that made everything look a bit eerie. But again, I've been in weirder places. As I walked around trying to shake off the stiffness in my legs, I noticed that the car hadn't moved. The fog on the windows made it impossible to see inside, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, just this uneasy feeling that made my skin crawl. I figured it was just the late hour playing tricks on me. I'd been driving for a long time after all. I tried to ignore it and went about my business, but the car kept drawing my attention. After a while, I couldn't help myself. I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. There was dried blood on the door handle. My heart started to race, but I convinced myself it could be anything. Maybe someone cut themselves while getting out. I took a deep breath and looked inside. What I saw made my stomach turn. The inside of the car was a disaster. There were clothes and paper scattered everywhere, as if someone had ransacked the place. And then there was the blood. On the seats, on the dashboard, even on the windows. A lot of blood. Enough to know that whatever happened here, it wasn't just a simple accident. There had been a fight, a bad one, and whoever was involved hadn't cleaned up. I backed away from the car, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to call the police, but my phone was in the truck. As I turned to hurry back, I noticed something that froze me in place. There were shadows moving in the distance, just beyond the glow of the rest stop lights. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw them again. Dark figures, slowly getting closer. Whoever had done this was still here, watching. I didn't think. I just ran back to my truck, my mind racing as fast as my legs. When I got inside, I locked the doors and grabbed my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. As I tried to make the call, I kept glancing out the window, hoping, praying, that the figures weren't getting closer. But they were. I could see them now, moving steadily toward my truck. There were at least 3 of them, maybe more, and they were coming fast. Panic hit me like a punch to the gut. I dropped the phone and fumbled with the keys, desperate to get the engine started. My hands were slick with sweat, and I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Finally, the engine roared to life, but the figures had noticed. They started running, their shapes becoming clearer in the dim light. I could make out their faces now, twisted and angry. They were coming for me. I slammed the truck into reverse, the tires squealing as I backed out of the parking spot. One of them was almost at the door, a hand reaching out as I sped backward, barely missing him. I didn't stop to think. I just hit the gas and drove out of there as fast as I could. My heart was racing, my mind a blur. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from that rest stop. When I finally felt safe enough to slow down, I pulled over and tried to collect myself. I was shaking all over, and it took me a while to calm down enough to think straight. I called the police and told them what happened, but when they went to check it out, the car was gone. No sign of the blood, no sign of the figures I saw, nothing. Just an empty rest stop, like nothing had ever happened. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was real, or maybe I was just so tired that my mind played tricks on me. But I know one thing for sure. I've never felt terror like that before, and I don't ever want to feel it again. Now, every time I pass by a rest stop late at night, I think about that car, those figures, and the blood. I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone else to stop. It's been months since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling that I barely escaped with my life. The roads aren't the same anymore. What used to be routine now feels like a gamble. I keep telling myself it was all in my head, that maybe I imagined it, but deep down, I know something was wrong. And the worst part? I'll never know what really happened or who those people were. And that haunts me more than anything else. The Hidden Cabin, I thought a weekend away would be perfect. My life had become too much work, stress, and the city noise. I needed quiet, somewhere I could be alone and think. So, I started searching for a place to rent, something secluded. That's when I found the cabin. It was on Craigslist, listed under vacation rentals. The ad was short, with just a few lines of text and some pictures. Escape the city, it said. Find peace in the woods. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin surrounded by thick trees with a lake nearby. It looked perfect, almost too perfect, but I didn't think too much about it. I just wanted to get away. The drive was long, hours passing without me seeing another car. The road became narrower as I went deeper into the forest until it was just me and the trees. My GPS lost signal, but I kept going. Turning back didn't seem like an option. I was so close. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures, small, quiet, hidden in the woods. It was almost beautiful in a simple way. I found the key under the mat, just like the owner said in the email. Inside, it was cozy, with old furniture and a fireplace that seemed unused for years. I felt a little uneasy, but I told myself it was just the drive that made me nervous. The first night was fine. I cooked, read a little, and listened to the silence. It was so quiet that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I thought that was what I needed. No noise, no people, just me and my thoughts. I slept well, better than I had in months. The next day, though, things started to change. The silence, which I had wanted so much, began to feel too much. It was like the trees were pressing in on me, their branches reaching out to touch the cabin. The feeling of being watched crept over me, but I tried to ignore it. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. That evening, I sat by the fire, trying to read, but I couldn't focus. I kept hearing noises outside, a rustling in the bushes. It was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then I heard something else, a faint tapping, like someone lightly knocking on the window. My heart started to race. I froze, listening, but it stopped as suddenly as it had started. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The tapping returned, louder this time. It was right outside my window. I didn't move, just lay there, listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then, as if to prove me wrong, I heard a whisper. It was so soft, almost like the wind, but it was definitely a voice. I couldn't understand what it was saying, but it was there, right outside my door. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The fear from the night before seemed silly in the daylight, but I still felt uneasy. I decided to explore the area, thinking that maybe a walk would clear my head. The woods were thick and dark, even during the day. It felt like the trees were hiding something. I didn't walk far before I found it. Another cabin, hidden deep in the woods. This one was old, much older than the one I was staying in. The wood was rotting, the windows broken. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but there were fresh footprints leading to the door. I don't know why, but I had to go inside. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. The air was stale, and everything was covered in dust, except for a small area in the corner where a blanket lay on the floor. It was like someone had been sleeping there recently. I ran back to my cabin, my heart pounding. Someone was out there, staying in that old cabin. I tried to tell myself it was just a hiker, but I knew it wasn't. I locked the door and didn't leave the cabin for the rest of the day. That night, the noises came back, worse than before. The rustling, the tapping, and then the whispering. It was louder now, more insistent. I grabbed the fireplace poker and stood in the middle of the room, staring at the door. The whispering grew louder, like whoever it was just outside, talking to me through the door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, but But when I pulled it open, there was nothing there, just the empty woods. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching the poker, watching the door until the first light of morning crept in. As soon as it was light enough, I packed my things and left. I didn't care that I had paid for the whole weekend. I just needed to get out. Driving away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. Just the empty road and the trees. I drove straight home and tried to forget about the whole thing, but I couldn't. A few weeks later, I tried to find the listing again, just to see if anyone else had stayed there, but it was gone, like it never existed. I even searched the area on a map, but there was no record of any cabin, not even the one I had stayed in. I still think about that weekend, about what would have happened if I had stayed. But one thing I know for sure, I'll never go back to those woods again. I've been working as a night shift delivery driver for the past few months. The pay isn't great, but I need the money. I don't ask questions about the packages I deliver. It's easier that way. But last night, something happened that I can't get out of my mind. It was raining, a heavy downpour that made it hard to see the road. My shift was almost over when I got a call from the dispatcher. He had one last job for me, a rush delivery to a place far outside the city. He didn't give me many details, just said it was urgent and that I needed to get there as soon as possible. I didn't want to take it, but I needed the overtime pay, so I agreed. When I arrived at the warehouse to pick up the package, something felt off. The place was quiet, too quiet for the middle of the night. The lights flickered and the air felt heavy. The dispatcher handed me a large, unmarked box. It was heavy, and when I asked him what was inside, he just gave me a strange look and told me to keep my mouth shut and deliver it. "Don't open it. Just get it to the address," he said. There was something in his voice that made me uneasy, but I didn't push it. I signed the paperwork and loaded the package into the back of my van. As I drove out of the city, the rain pounded on the windshield, making it hard to see the road. The wipers struggled to keep up, and the headlights barely cut through the darkness. The route took me through winding, narrow roads that seemed to go on forever. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. The city lights faded, replaced by dense trees and shadows. About halfway to the destination, I started hearing noises coming from the back of the van. At first, I thought it was just the road, maybe the box shifting around. But then the noises became more distinct, like something moving inside the box. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart pounding. I knew I shouldn't open the package, but my curiosity got the better of me. I walked to the back of the van and stood there for a long time, just staring at the box. The rain was pouring down, soaking me to the bone, but I couldn't move. The box was silent now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wanted to open it, to see what was inside, but I was too scared. My hands were shaking as I reached out to touch the box, but I pulled back at the last second. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the noise was probably just something shifting during the drive. I got back into the driver's seat and continued the journey, but the unease stayed with me. The closer I got to the address, the worse the feeling became. The road narrowed even more, and the trees closed in around me, blocking out what little light there was. Finally, I arrived at the destination, a small, run-down cabin in the middle of nowhere. There were no other houses nearby, no lights, nothing. Just the cabin and the darkness. I parked the van and got out, the rain still pouring down. As I walked up to the door, I noticed the windows were boarded up, and the place looked abandoned. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I was about to turn around and leave when the door creaked open, and a man appeared. He looked disheveled, his clothes wrinkled and dirty. His eyes darted around nervously, and he didn't say a word as he motioned for me to bring the package inside. I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong. I told him he needed to sign for the package, but he just shook his head and told me to leave it. That's when I noticed something on the box, a small tear in the corner. I don't know why I did it, but I leaned in closer to look. That's when I saw it. A hand. A human hand. Pale and lifeless, sticking out of the tear. My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over myself. The man saw that I had noticed and lunged at me, grabbing the package. He was frantic, his eyes wide with fear, and something else, something dark. I knew I had to get out of there. I pushed him away, threw the package at him, and ran back to the van. I didn't look back as I sped away, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain made it hard to see, but I didn't care. I just needed to get as far away from that cabin as possible. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Was it real? Could it have been something else? But the image of that hand was burned into my memory. When I finally made it back to the city, I parked the van and just sat there trying to calm down. I thought about going to the police, but I was too scared. What if they didn't believe me? What if the dispatcher found out? I couldn't risk it. So I went home and tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. The next day, I saw a news report about a missing person. The description matched the hand I had seen. I felt sick to my stomach. I wanted to do something, but I was too scared. What if it led back to me? What if they thought I was involved? Now, I'm sitting here, staring at my phone, wondering if I should make an anonymous tip. But I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I don't know what to do. All I can see is that hand, and I don't think I'll ever be able to forget it. The stranger in the parking lot. I've been a nurse for over 10 years, and I've worked all kinds of shifts, but something about the night shift is different. There's a certain quiet that settles over the hospital, a silence that's both comforting and unnerving. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. My shift had ended, and I was exhausted, more so than usual. The clock had just hit 5:00 a.m., and the hospital corridors were empty, with only the soft hum of the lights overhead keeping me company as I headed to the parking lot. The parking lot at this hour is a strange place. It's large, with most of the spaces empty. The few cars that remain are scattered, and the lights are dim, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. The sky was just beginning to lighten, but the sun wasn't up yet, leaving everything in a dull gray light. I could hear the echo of my footsteps as I walked, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls around me. I had parked far away from the entrance, thinking the walk would do me good after a long shift. But as I walked, I started to regret that decision. The silence that I usually found calming felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. My keys jingled in my hand, and I quickened my pace, eager to get to my car and head home. That's when I saw him. He was standing by the entrance, just a shadow at first. As I got closer, I noticed he was dressed too neatly for this time of morning. Dark slacks, a button-up shirt, and a coat that looked expensive. His clothes didn't fit the setting. Something about him felt off, but I told myself I was just tired, that I was overreacting. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept walking, pretending I hadn't seen him. My car was in sight, and I focused on it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as I reached my car, I heard footsteps behind me, quick and firm. I turned around, and he was there, standing too close, too fast. "Hey, do you remember me?" he asked, smiling like we were old friends. I stared at him, my mind racing. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. I meet so many people at the hospital. It's hard to remember everyone. but he spoke with such confidence, as if we'd met before. I didn't know what to say, so I just shook my head. No? I was here last week with my mother, he continued, stepping closer. You were the one who took care of her. You were really kind. I forced a smile, trying to be polite. I'm sorry, I don't remember, I said, turning to unlock my car. He didn't move. Instead, he smiled wider, like he was amused. It's okay. You must see a lot of people, but I remember you. You're Anna, right? My heart skipped a beat. How did he know my name? I hadn't told him. Maybe he saw it on my name tag, I thought. But something about the way he said it, so casually, so confidently, made my skin crawl. I really need to get going, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I opened my car door, hoping he'd take the hint and leave me alone, but he didn't. I know where you live, you know, he said suddenly, his voice soft, almost kind. You live in that small house on Maple Street, right? With the blue shutters? I froze. That wasn't something he could have known by accident. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. How do you know that? I demanded, my voice shaking now. He just smiled, like we were sharing a secret. It's a small town, Anna. Everyone knows everyone. My hands were trembling as I reached for my phone. I needed to call for help, but when I pressed the power button, the screen stayed black. My phone was dead. Panic started to set in. I was alone in a dark parking lot with a man who knew too much about me, and there was no one around to help. I really need to go, I said again, more forcefully this time. I tried to sound brave, but my voice cracked. I stepped back, but he moved with me, keeping the distance between us the same. Why are you in such a hurry? He asked, his tone shifting. The friendliness was gone now, replaced with something colder. We're just talking. Don't you want to talk? No, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. I gripped my car keys tightly, the metal digging into my palm. I need you to leave me alone. His smile faded, and his eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, and I could feel the weight of his presence bearing down on me. What if I don't want to? He said, his voice low and threatening. I didn't think. I just acted. I swung my keys at him, aiming for his face. He jumped back, surprised, and for a second, I thought I might have a chance to get away. I turned and ran, not towards my car, but towards the entrance of the hospital, hoping someone would still be inside. But just as I started to run, I heard a voice calling out. I turned and saw a security guard coming towards us from the far end of the parking lot. The man's expression changed instantly. He backed away, hands up, like he was just a harmless stranger. But before he left, he leaned in close, his voice a whisper in my ear. I'll see you again soon, Anna. Then he was gone, slipping into the shadows like he had never been there. The security guard reached me, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't speak. All I could think about was his parting words, the promise he had made. I haven't seen him since that morning, but I know he's out there, watching, waiting. Every time I leave the hospital, I feel his eyes on me, and I wonder when he'll decide to make good on his promise. I never thought working as a janitor would lead me to this. It was just a night job, cleaning a government building when everyone else had gone home. It was quiet, almost peaceful, and I liked that. The emptiness of the halls, the silence, it made the work easy. But there were places I was told never to go. Restricted areas. I never questioned it until that night. I was on the third floor mopping near the elevators when I heard something strange. It wasn't loud, just a faint noise, like machinery running deep underground. I stopped and listened. It was there, a low hum. But there was something else too. Something that sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded like a cry, distant but real. I told myself it was nothing, just the building settling or some machine left on. But it kept nagging at me. Curiosity got the better of me. I knew the building like the back of my hand, but this sound seemed to come from somewhere I'd never been. I followed it, letting the noise guide me down the hallway. It led me to a door I had never noticed before. It looked like an ordinary storage closet, but the sound was louder here. I opened the door expecting to find a janitor's closet full of supplies, but instead I found an elevator. This was strange. I'd been working here for months, and I'd never seen or heard of this elevator. It didn't even look like the others, older, more industrial. My hand hesitated over the button, but the curiosity was too strong. I pressed it. The elevator door slid open, revealing a small, dimly lit space. I stepped inside, and before I could change my mind, the doors closed, and the elevator began to descend. It went down far longer than I expected. The hum grew louder, and I started to feel uneasy. This place was not on any map, and I'd never heard of anything below the main floors. When the elevator finally stopped, the doors opened to a cold, sterile hallway. It looked nothing like the rest of the building. The walls were white, the floors polished metal, and the air smelled of antiseptic. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. There were doors on either side, each one marked with a number, but no windows, nothing to tell me what was inside. I felt like I was in a hospital, but something was very wrong here. My heart pounded as I reached the end of the hall, where a larger door stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was massive, filled with machines and medical equipment I didn't recognize. In the center, there were cages, big enough to hold a person. They were empty, but the sight of them made my blood run cold. Papers were scattered across a desk, and I couldn't resist looking. They were reports, files, but what they described was horrifying. Human experiments, done on people who had been taken off the streets, homeless, criminals, anyone who wouldn't be missed. They were testing something dangerous, and these people were the guinea pigs. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was wrong, evil. I needed to leave, to tell someone, but as I turned to go, I heard a noise behind me. A group of security guards stood in the doorway, guns drawn. They didn't say a word as they grabbed me, pulling me out of the room and down another hallway. I struggled, tried to explain that I didn't mean any harm, that I was just a janitor, but they didn't care. They took me to a small room and threw me inside. The door slammed shut, and I was left in darkness. After what felt like hours, the door opened again, and a man walked in. He wore a lab coat, his face cold and emotionless. He didn't seem surprised to see me, just disappointed. He explained in a calm voice that I had seen too much. This place was off limits for a reason, he said. The work they were doing was necessary, he claimed, for the safety of the country. But I didn't believe him. I couldn't. What they were doing wasn't right. I realized they weren't going to let me go. I was a loose end, something that needed to be tied up. Fear gripped me, and I knew I had to get out, no matter what. When the scientist turned his back, I made my move. I rushed him, knocking him over, and bolted out of the room. Alarms blared as I ran through the hallways, desperately trying to find a way out. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. I was lucky. I found the elevator again and hit the button over and over until the doors finally opened. I jumped inside, and as the doors closed, I saw the guards running towards me. The elevator shot up, and I collapsed against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the main floor, I ran out of the building, not stopping until I was far away. But I knew I wasn't safe. They would come after me. They couldn't let me live knowing what I knew. I'm writing this now, not because I think it will save me, but because people need to know the truth. There's a place beneath that building, a place where horrors happen, and it's all hidden behind the guise of government work. If you work in a place like this, be careful. Don't go where you're not supposed to. Don't be curious. It might be the last mistake you ever make. I don't know how long I have before they find me, but I had to tell someone. If you don't hear from me again, you'll know why. And if you see something that doesn't seem right, don't stay silent. Speak up before it's too late. It was just another night at the gas station, the kind where nothing happens, and time crawls. The clock showed almost midnight, and I was counting down the minutes until I could lock up and head home. The station was quiet, just the soft hum of the neon lights and the distant sound of cars on the highway. I had worked this late shift many times, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the dark clouds gathering outside or the way the silence pressed down on me, making me feel like I wasn't alone. As I wiped down the counter for the 100th time, I heard the door chime. I looked up, expecting to see one of the regulars, but instead, a man stumbled in. He looked like he'd been through hell. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he was out of breath, like he'd been running for miles. His eyes were wild, darting around the room as if he was searching for something, or someone. "Help me," he gasped, leaning against the counter for support. "Please, someone's after me." I didn't know what to think. People come in all the time with crazy stories, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made my skin crawl. He wasn't just scared, he was terrified, like he was running from something truly dangerous. I wanted to help, but I wasn't sure how. I glanced at the phone, thinking maybe I should call the police, but before I could decide, the man's head snapped toward the window. Outside, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, and a black car pulled into the station, stopping a few feet from the door. The man's face went pale, and he grabbed my arm, his grip so tight it hurt. "Turn off the lights," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Lock the doors. They can't see us." I hesitated. This was getting out of hand. Who were they? And why was this guy so scared? But the fear in his eyes made me move. I quickly reached over and flipped off the lights, plunging the station into darkness. My hands shook as I locked the doors, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the car's engine outside, idling in the night. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's after you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched behind the counter, peeking over the edge at the car outside. "They're killers," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. They take people, and they don't come back." It sounded crazy, but the way he said it made me believe him. Or maybe it was just the fear getting to me. I didn't know what to think anymore. I crouched down next to him, trying to see out the window without being seen. The car's headlights were still on, but I couldn't see who was inside. Then the car door opened, and two figures stepped out. They were just shapes in the dark, but there was something about the way they moved that sent a chill down my spine. They weren't in a hurry, like they knew we were trapped and had all the time in the world. The man next to me started shaking, and I could hear him muttering under his breath, begging for it to end. The figures approached the station, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night. They stopped at the door, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, they knocked. First softly, then harder. The sound was like a hammer hitting my chest, each knock making it harder to breathe. I wanted to tell them to go away, but the words stuck in my throat. "Don't let them in," the man whispered urgently. "Please, they'll kill us both." I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to believe this was all a mistake, that maybe these people were just lost or looking for help. But another part of me, the part that was soaked in fear, knew that wasn't true. These weren't people you could reason with. They were here for a reason, and I had a feeling it wasn't good. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, I thought maybe they had given up. But then the door handle rattled, and the door shook as they tried to force it open. The man next to me grabbed a metal pipe from under the counter, holding it like a weapon. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were focused, like he knew this was his last chance. The door held, but I could see it wouldn't for long. They were going to get in, and when they did, there would be no stopping them. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I fight? Should I run? But there was nowhere to go. No way out except through the door they were about to break down. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. The silence was deafening, like the world was holding its breath. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, every beat a reminder that I was still alive. For now. I risked a glance out the window and saw the figures standing by the car again, their faces still hidden in the shadows. One of them turned toward the station, and I felt their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. Then, without a word, they got back into the car. The engine roared to life, and they sped off into the night, disappearing as quickly as they had come. For a long moment, neither of us moved. We just sat there, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, the man spoke, his voice shaky but relieved. "They're gone," he said, almost like he couldn't believe it himself. They didn't get us." But I wasn't so sure. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like jelly, and looked out the window. The night was quiet again, but it felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. I knew they might come back, and if they did, I wasn't sure I'd be so lucky next time. The man thanked me, his voice filled with gratitude and something else, maybe shame or fear that he would have to run again. He left without saying much more, disappearing into the night, just like the car had. I locked the doors again and sat behind the counter, trying to calm my racing heart. The station was silent, but the fear lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. I didn't know what had just happened or why, but I knew one thing. I would never forget that night, and I would never work the late shift again. When I took the job as a night security guard, I thought it would be easy money. I was assigned to a construction site in a quiet part of the city, a place where most buildings were half-built or abandoned. My job was simple: walk around the site, make sure no one was messing with the equipment, and keep an eye on the unfinished building in the center. The boss told me there had been some vandalism, nothing serious, just kids breaking windows and spray painting walls. My first night was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hear things you shouldn't. I tried to distract myself by listening to music, but it didn't help. The construction site was dark, with only a few lights around the perimeter. The unfinished building loomed in the middle, a hulking shadow with empty windows that looked like dead eyes. I didn't like it, but I didn't have a choice. I had to check it out. During my first round, I heard something. At first, it was just a faint sound, like someone walking on gravel. I stopped and listened, but it was gone. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or maybe an animal. But then I heard it again, this time louder, coming from inside the building. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to go in and check. The inside was a mess of scaffolding and concrete, a labyrinth of half-finished rooms and staircases. I walked around, shining my flashlight into every corner, but I didn't see anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about the sounds I heard. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was letting the creepy atmosphere get to me. But the next night, it happened again. The sounds were louder this time, more distinct. Footsteps, whispers, maybe even breathing. It was like someone was playing with me, staying just out of sight. I started seeing things too. Shadows moving in the corners of my vision, disappearing when I turned my head. I would shine my flashlight into the darkness, but there was never anything there. It was driving me crazy. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I started doubting myself, wondering if I was going insane. After a few nights of this, I decided to check the building during the day. I figured I might find something that would explain what was going on. Maybe there were squatters, or maybe I'd find some evidence of the vandals. What I found was worse. The building looked different in the daylight, less menacing but still creepy. I walked around searching for clues, and that's when I found the signs. There were food wrappers, cigarette butts, and a makeshift bed made out of old blankets and cardboard. Someone had been living here. The thought made my skin crawl. If they were here during the day, where were they at night? And were they the ones making the noises? I suddenly felt very vulnerable, knowing I had been alone here with someone who didn't want to be found. That night, I was on edge. I kept thinking about the bed, about who might be using it. The noises started again, but this time I didn't try to investigate. I didn't want to know who or what was making them. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, real movement. I turned and saw a group of men entering the building. They didn't see me, so I quickly hid behind a stack of cement bags, peeking out just enough to watch them. They were talking quietly, but I could hear enough to understand that they were planning something illegal. They were discussing drugs, weapons, and money, things that should have nothing to do with a construction site. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. I knew I had to get out of there, but I was terrified of making any noise. I tried to move quietly, but as I took a step back, I knocked over a metal pipe. The clanging echoed through the building, and I froze, hoping they didn't hear it. But they did. One of them looked in my direction, his face hardening. "Who's there?" he shouted, and I knew I was in trouble. They started searching the building, and I had no choice but to run. I took off, sprinting through the dark hallways, trying to stay ahead of them. I could hear their footsteps behind me, getting closer. My lungs were burning, and I could feel panic rising in my chest. I stumbled down a staircase, nearly falling, and dashed through the maze of scaffolding. I managed to find a small room and hid inside, pressing myself against the wall, trying to control my breathing. I could hear them searching the floors above me, their voices angry and getting closer. I knew I couldn't stay hidden for long. I needed to get out. I waited until their voices moved away, then made a break for the exit. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, not daring to look back. I burst out of the building and didn't stop until I was at my car. I jumped in and drove away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I called the police from a gas station down the road. They arrived quickly, and after I told them what happened, they headed to the site. I waited, my heart still racing. Eventually they came back and told me they had arrested the men. They were part of a gang using the building as a hideout. The police thanked me for my help, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt lucky to be alive. I quit the job the next day. I couldn't go back there, not after what happened. The experience still haunts me. Every time I think about it, I feel that same fear, that same dread, knowing how close I came to never leaving that building. It was supposed to be an easy job, but it almost cost me everything. I've been working the night shift at the post office for a while now. It's not a glamorous job, but it's quiet. It's the kind of job that gives you time to think, though sometimes that's not a good thing. The building is old, with creaky floors and flickering lights, but usually I don't mind. It's just me and the mail, and most nights are uneventful. You get used to the loneliness, the silence only broken by the rustle of paper or the hum of the machines. I find a kind of peace in it, a routine that numbs the mind and lets the hours slip by. But tonight, something was different. I was going through the usual pile of letters, sorting them by address, when I found one that made me stop. The envelope was plain, nothing special, but the name and address on it didn't make sense. I had never heard of the person or the street. The postmark was smudged, almost like it was trying to hide something. I should have just set it aside, but something about it got under my skin. I felt an odd pull, a curiosity that I couldn't shake. I knew it was against the rules to open someone else's mail, but rules feel different when you're alone in the middle of the night. I told myself it was just to check if there was a return address inside, something to help me deliver it properly. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the real reason. I wanted to know what was inside, so I opened it. The letter inside was typed, neat and precise. As I read, my heart started to race. It wasn't a normal letter. It was a plan, a detailed plan to kill someone. The time and place were listed clearly, and the method was described in cold clinical detail. Whoever wrote this had done it before. I could feel the ice in their words, the way they described the victim like they were nothing more than a problem to be solved. The worst part was the time. It was for tonight, just a few hours from now. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to call the police, but then I hesitated. What if it was a joke? Or worse, what if it wasn't, and by calling, I somehow made it real? The more I thought about it, the more confused I got. My head was spinning with the possibilities, each one darker than the last. I felt a cold sweat on my skin, my hands shaking as I folded the letter back up. That's when I started to notice things. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I got this strange feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked around, but the post office was empty, just like always. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, and I could swear I heard footsteps echoing down the hall, but when I checked, there was no one there. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was freaking out over nothing, but it didn't help. My mind kept going back to the letter, to the cold, precise words. What if someone knew I had read it? What if that was part of the plan? The idea that someone could be watching me, that they were waiting for me to make a move, sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't just sit there. I had to do something. The clock was ticking, and I couldn't get the image of that poor person out of my head, the one marked for death in that letter. I made up my mind to go to the address mentioned, to see for myself if it was real. It felt crazy, but I didn't see any other choice. I grabbed my coat and headed out into the night. The streets were dark and empty, the city asleep around me. Every shadow seemed to hide something, and every sound made me jump. The closer I got to the address, the more my stomach tightened. It was in a part of town I wasn't familiar with, a place where the streetlights barely worked and the buildings looked abandoned. I started to wonder if I was walking into a trap, if the letter was meant for me all along. When I reached the location, my heart was pounding in my chest. It was a rundown building, the kind that looks like it hasn't seen life in years. I hesitated at the entrance, my breath fogging in the cold air. I could feel the weight of the letter in my pocket, the words burned into my mind. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but whatever it was, I wasn't ready. I stepped inside, the door creaking loudly in the silence. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of dampness hit me immediately. I moved slowly, my eyes trying to adjust to the darkness. That's when I saw someone. A figure standing in the shadows, just out of reach of the dim light coming through the cracked windows. I couldn't tell if they were facing me or looking away. My heart skipped a beat, my mind racing with possibilities. Was this the killer, the victim, or someone else entirely? I wanted to speak, to say something, but my throat was dry and no words came out. The figure moved, just slightly, and I froze. I didn't know what to do. My mind was a blur of fear and doubt. Then I realized something. This was all wrong. The letter, the place, even me being here. It all felt like a setup, like I was being played. Before I could react, the figure took a step toward me, and I panicked. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing loudly as I fled the building. I didn't stop until I was back on the street gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Now, sitting here in the safety of my small apartment, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That letter, those words, they're still with me. And I can't help but wonder if this was just the beginning. Maybe I was never supposed to find that letter, or maybe I was meant to. Either way, I can't stop thinking about what might happen next, and whether I'll be ready when it does. It was supposed to be a quiet night. I'm used to the night shifts. Most of the time, they're calm, almost boring. But tonight, something felt different. The quiet hours always made me uneasy, but it's something I'd learned to ignore. The clock showed 2:15 a.m., and I'd only taken a few calls so far, nothing serious. Maybe a noise complaint or a minor accident. The kind of stuff you forget by morning. I was sipping my lukewarm coffee when the phone rang again. The usual jolt of adrenaline hit, but I settled quickly. I pressed the button to answer. 911, what's your emergency? Silence. Hello, do you need help? I asked, expecting maybe a child playing with the phone or someone too scared to speak. But there was nothing. Just a faint sound like breathing. Heavy, slow breathing. Can you hear me? I tried again, feeling the hairs on my arms start to rise. Still, nothing. After a few more seconds, the line went dead. I sat there for a moment, staring at the screen, waiting for something else, but nothing happened. Just a prank, I thought. It wasn't the first time I'd gotten a weird call like that, but something about it stuck with me, like a shadow you see from the corner of your eye. I went back to my work, trying to shake off the strange feeling. But about 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. I hesitated before answering. 911, what's your emergency? More breathing. This time it was louder, like the person was standing right next to me, breathing into my ear. I felt a chill run down my spine. My hands started to sweat. Who is this? Do you need help? I demanded, my voice firmer now. But still, there was no answer. The call ended just like before. For the next hour, the calls kept coming. Each one was the same, just breathing, nothing else. Each time, the sound was more unsettling, more suffocating. I couldn't focus. My hands were trembling so much I could barely type. I started checking the call logs, looking for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. The numbers were all different, from places far apart, places that made no sense. But each call felt like it was coming from the same person. I started to feel like I was being watched, like someone was out there, playing a game I didn't understand. Then, the worst call came. The phone rang again, and when I looked at the caller ID, I froze. It was my own home number. My blood turned to ice. How could that be? I was here, at the station. My phone should be at home, on the table where I left it. I answered, my voice shaking. 911, what's your emergency? The same breathing, only this time, it was even closer, like the person was right there, in my house, standing in the same room. I felt sick. My stomach twisted, and I thought I might throw up. My mind raced. Was someone in my house? How did they get my number? What did they want? Panic gripped me. I didn't know what to do. I thought about leaving the station, going home, but I was too scared to move. What if they were waiting for me? What if they knew everything about me, where I lived, what I did? I forced myself to think. I called my neighbor, someone I barely knew, and asked them to check my house. I must have sounded crazy, but they agreed. Minutes passed like hours as I waited for them to call me back. When they did, they said everything was normal, no sign of anyone. But I couldn't believe it. How could it be normal when I felt like my whole world was crashing down? I couldn't focus on work anymore. I started going through my phone records, security feeds, anything I could find that might explain what was happening. But nothing made sense. My house was locked, my phone was where I left it, and there was no sign of anyone else. But the calls kept coming, each one more terrifying than the last. I jumped at every noise, every creak of the building. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Finally, just before my shift ended, the phone rang one last time. I looked at the screen, heart pounding, and saw my home number again. My hands shook as I picked up the receiver, but this time there was no breathing, just silence. It was worse than the breathing. I waited, my heart racing, for something to happen, but the silence stretched on. It felt like the world had stopped, like time itself was holding its breath. And then, the call ended. I sat there, staring at the phone, feeling completely empty, like something had been taken from me that I'd never get back. I don't know what those calls were, who was behind them, or what they wanted. But I know that night changed something in me. I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe again. The silence, it's worse than the noise, worse than the breathing. It's a void that I can't escape. And now, every time my phone rings, I feel that same dread, that same fear that whoever, or whatever, called me that night might come back.